We're continuing on page 125 of your journal. We're talking about Corinth again this week. The tension that we're facing as readers of the Bible is that we do know that the Bible is written about them for then. And that's something that we know. We have historical sort of stuff that we read to help us understand that. But then there's this thing that goes on with Scripture that's deep in our confession of what it is to be Christian, is that even though the text is for them, for then, it speaks to you and me here and now, today. And so our constant wrestle is about how these texts work with us. What was written to help the problems of the world's first Christians speak to our first world problems in really clear ways, sometimes. Other times it seems less obvious about how these texts relate to our day-to-day lives. Now, in 1 Corinthians, Paul seems to quite regularly be answering questions that are posed to him. It seems that in some previous letter, the Corinthians have written to Paul and said, hey, here's a list of sort of stuff that we're dealing with. And Paul answers those questions. He's not a politician, so he does actually answer them. He doesn't avoid them, but he is a pastor and a theologian, so what he does often do is takes what appears to be a very simple question and makes it really complex. He says, right, here's one particular issue, but what you don't realize is beneath this issue, there are bigger concerns going on. So whereas sometimes it seems that the Corinthians just want a yes or a no from Paul, what they get is a broad discussion about our lives and about God. It's amazing how often life is like that, isn't it? You lift the lid on what you thought was a tiny issue and peer inside and realize, oh my goodness, this is so much bigger than I'd first thought. One of those cases is in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and that's where we're going to be today. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, a problem you all have struggled with deeply this week. Now, of course, if you lived in Corinth, this would be a problem for you. It was very difficult in first century Corinth to gain access to meat that hadn't been involved in some sort of ritual or cultic ceremony. If you were of the lower echelons of society, you wouldn't access a lot of meat in your day-to-day life. Your sort of calorie intake would be predominantly via vegetables and grains if you were fortunate. So meat wouldn't really be something you had huge sort of ability to buy. So if you could afford to buy meat, you'd kind of take whatever meat you could get your hands on that you could afford. If you were from the higher echelons of society, it would be important for you to kind of engage in the right social circles so that you could get ahead. We said last week that Corinth was very entrepreneurial. There was a lot of sort of business and progress going on there. And much the same as today, if you want to get ahead in society, you need to be in the right places. And most society parties in those days would happen with some sort of honoring both of a person, but also of the gods of the city and the gods of the empire. So it would be very difficult to go to a social connection and not be involved also in eating a meal that somehow was honoring to the gods and also had, produce in that meal that had been sort of offered to the gods first. So what does a Christian do? A Christian wants to live the life that follows Jesus in first century Corinth, but here they have a problem that just something as simple as trying to eat food has become deeply complex because they're trying to honor God. For Paul, of course, this is so much bigger an issue than just simply meat. And you often find this throughout the New Testament. You'll read and realize there's something else going on here. So look at what Paul does. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world. There's a classic Jewish scriptural comment on idols. Idols are just bits of wood or shapes of metal that people bow down to. So if you read Isaiah, for example, in the Old Testament, you will find that very often this thing gets brought up that idols aren't actually physically real. They're not actual gods. Now, the reason that Jewish people confess this clearly comes down to the Shema, this prayer that they pray every morning, in fact, several times throughout the day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is the only God, or the Lord is one, sometimes it's translated. And Paul piles both these logics together. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. So what Paul's saying right at the beginning is, the idols aren't real. They're not actually God. So we're not involved in a debate between which God is the true God here, because Paul confesses there is only one option when it comes to the gods. Something that we should always try and remember. For even if there are so-called gods, Paul continues, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and there are many lords. And then Paul applies this little piece of reworked Christian tradition here. He quotes this poem, which a lot of people think a lot of Christians were probably saying as part of their worship service in these sort of days. Yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. Do you notice how Paul takes a conversation about what type of meat are you allowed to eat? And very quickly, it's now a conversation about what do you think about God? And the question seems to relate around your union with God and your allegiance to the only God. So what seems like give us a yes or a no, Paul. Can we eat that? Can we not eat that? Paul then says, well, this isn't actually a question about can I or can't I. This is a question about who is God? Who do you think God is? And what's your connection to him? So most of us could relate to that type of question. We might immediately think, well, I'm not quite sure what that's got to do with me if we're talking about idol food. But the question about what do we think of God and how is our allegiance to him affected by the way that we live is a very common question for Christians. 1 Corinthians 8, as do many of the texts in the Corinthian epistles, actually, they encourage us to shine theological spotlights on many aspects of our lives that we just take for granted. It's just the way we live, we sometimes say. And Paul asks us to turn that theological thinking onto just the way we live and say, well, how does this affect your relationship with God? You see, in Paul's time, the wrestle for Christians was, if Jesus is Lord, what does that say about Caesar? Because the world calls him Lord. And if Jesus is Lord, then surely Caesar cannot be Lord. Which, of course, then means that nationalism can be a form of idolatry. When we can confuse our faith with patriotism, we find ourselves in awkward places. Economic practices that seem to make sense of how the world works can become an idolatry when we confuse wealth with blessing and forget about the poor. And then there's the idols that we wrestle with. Many of you struggle with this idol. It sits in the corner of your room. It's about 52 inches in diameter. It's got 4K definition, sometimes with 3D and surround sound. Or maybe it's your house or your vacation or your car. Our stuff has this habit of being things that we think are there to serve us, and very quickly we start serving them. Materialism, perhaps the one thing that we struggle so much with in the West, actually can take over and become idolatrous to us. Now, at heart, we know that these things are probably not inherently wrong as they stand, but how we engage with them, how we relate to them, reminds us that we've got to handle things carefully, because something can very quickly move from just stuff to being idols. And Paul's logic for why you need to be careful with what you eat actually is a little deeper than that. He escalates slightly in chapter 8. In verse 7, he says this, but not everyone possesses this knowledge about God. So some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it's defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do eat. You see, for Paul, this issue of idol meat is also a question about slippage. He takes your actions, which in themselves might appear quite innocuous, and overlays them on the possible result of those possible actions. You see, because an idol might mean nothing to someone. That someone might confess that this idol isn't even real, so I can eat whatever meat that I want. But if the perception of what I'm doing causes another person to come to the conclusion that maybe the idols are real, and maybe I should worship those idols because I've seen this good Christian brother having his idol meat sandwich on his way to work, maybe I now become an idol worshiper. And so Paul says that if the innocuous action over here causes someone else to be led into pagan worship, then that now becomes a concern. You see, because Christianity from its very onset was primarily an evangelistic movement. It was a movement that wanted to bring other people into connection with this crucified Jesus. And as a result, Christianity doesn't hide away in the backdrops of the world. It engages with its surrounding society. But this brings with it inherent problems. As Margaret MacDonald said in her book on the Pauline churches, she says, early Christianity's strong interest in the evangelization of others made accommodation to the world most likely. Because if we're always hanging around people who are not Christian, with the express intention of drawing them towards Jesus, we live with the permanent threat of being drawn away from Jesus in the presence of where we hang out or talk or have friendships or have social networks. And Christianity has to live in this balance. Christianity is never one of these separatist movements. It's never the type of movement that when you join, we build a wall, 4 walls and no doors and say, now you stay here, cut off from everyone forever. So when you see Christians that start to live in very separatist ways, that's not really the evangelistic heart of our movement. But we live permanently as people who understand the call to represent Jesus in our world. We live permanently in the threat that actually our being Christian creates tensions for us in the world that we live. If you've ever hesitated to tell someone that you're a Christian for whatever reason, then you know this trouble is true. Maybe you're in a situation you realize, I'm not sure it's the most appropriate thing to say here, or what will people think of me if I say that, or perhaps they'll change how they act towards me. And if you've gone through anything like that in your thinking in your life, then you're relating to the challenge that the church has perennially faced. How do we live as Jesus followers in the world, but not be drawn into the world with all of its various trappings that it has? Sociological theorists tell us that the best way to preserve a unique culture is to create strong boundaries. And if you create strong boundaries, then the culture will be allowed to preserve itself within that. But Christianity finds itself mandated by the lordship of Jesus to actually live in the threat of assimilation and be God's people regardless. Richard Hayes, in his work on Corinthians, says, these questions must be posed to Christian churches that have grown comfortably familiar with their cultural setting. As the world becomes increasingly secular and pluralistic, we find ourselves in a situation more like that of the first century Christians, having to rethink our allegiances in fundamental ways. Because the challenge for the church is we've actually kind of gotten comfortable in the world that we live in, and sometimes it's not always clear to see whether there's any difference between being the church or just any other social club in the Western context. And sometimes it's actually so easy to be Christian that the difference between Christian and just a good citizen is hard for people to always see. And that probably says more about the church's shift one way rather than the church's ability to draw people in to the way of Jesus. But of course, for Paul, this is bigger than just you. This just isn't about individualism. And here's why. He continues in verse 9. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister, for whom Christ died, is destroyed by your knowledge. When you sin against them in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. And everybody from Alberta shifts uncomfortably on their chairs. Notice how what Paul is essentially saying is that I might be right in what I do. My behavior might be acceptable. There might be nothing theologically wrong in what I do, but that has an implication on others. It has an implication on other Christians that I spend time with, and that now is of concern to me. But notice what he does in verse 12. Notice how all of a sudden the conversation just shifts slightly in its language. When you sin against them, Paul says. Whoa, you sit back. When did we start talking about sin? When did the language change to talk about that? And Paul escalates a conversation which started with, can I eat that sandwich or not? We're now talking about some pretty deep stuff and some pretty difficult and awkward stuff. You see, for many of us that grew up in a Western context, sin is something that fractures your relationship with God. We think of sin on a kind of vertical axis. It's me and it's God, and sin's the thing that gets in between us. And part of the reason we think that way is our Western individualistic society has started to affect our theology. So when we live in a culture that is so self-centered and focused just on me, we start to look for theology that supports our Western ideology. And we end up with, well, it's just about me and God. And Christianity becomes a spiritual thing that's just about me and God. But Paul, in fact, the New Testament, in fact, the whole Bible, never talk about sin in such a single way. Yes, sin is something that fractures your relationship with God, but notice here how Paul now starts to talk about sin as something that causes a problem and fractures your relationship with others. He brings a horizontal axis onto it and says, here's another place that sin works. Because he's told you right from the start, you eating this meat sandwich hasn't caused a problem between you and God. The problem that's being generated is between you and the other people in your church. It's almost as if he thinks that sin works both vertically and horizontally. It's working both these ways. It doesn't just work on one spectrum. And either way that you encounter these problems, this creates a problem in your relationship with God. So what Paul does is he takes Christianity from being an individualist movement and says it's a community movement. It's about us. So the Christian might do something which is inherently okay. The sandwich looks good. The pickles are particularly tasty on it. The meat was bought from an idol's temple, but, idols aren't even real, so it's just the same as buying meat from anywhere. But then the moment that you doing that causes somebody else to go down the wrong path and to think the wrong things, then the initial judgment of, is this okay or not, becomes different. It changes. Now that's quite heavy, to think that my actions, which in and of themselves might be okay, if they are misinterpreted by someone else and that person chooses sinful choices as a result of what I've done, then Paul turns that around and says, hey, you've got some responsibility in this. A brief little sidebar. This text has been used by Christians throughout the centuries to basically talk about offense. And I've heard many churches say that what this means is if you offend another Christian, then you should stop it because of this particular text. Now, if you've been around church for a while, you know the difficulty with that is Christians are the easiest people in the world to offend. Right? And there's nothing easier, right? And this text has been used to say, well, I'm offended, so you can't do that. So as a result, Christians ended up being allowed to do nothing because always someone was getting offended by it. But this text has got nothing to do with being offended. This text is about sin. It's about the relationships between God that happen in community and in our life and following of Jesus. Paul's talking about how our actions impact others and generate fractures in those relationships. This is a problem for Paul, and you'll notice this theme weaving its way throughout all of the Corinthian letters, the theme of how do we pull ourselves together. So by chapter 12, he talks about it like this. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. So Paul takes this metaphorical example of a body and says that's actually what the church is like. You can't live in individualistic parts of your body. Your body is not a collection of individual parts. In one sense it is, but then one day when you're barefoot in the garage and you drop the can of paint on your little toe, you realize after you've praised Jesus for a while how connected your body is. You realize that actually what goes on down here affects up here. And Paul says this is what it's like in community. We're all connected together. Now, secretly, you know this. We know it's true. We just don't often want to admit it when it comes to our own sin. But we know that the things that we do which are sinful, we know they affect more than just us and God. Think about what happens when leaders have moral failings. The whole church is affected. Everybody's impacted by those sort of decisions. When people have affairs, it's more than just the marriage that ends up broken as a result of the affair. Maybe you've had two friends who are arguing. You notice how complex your life becomes because of their fight? You have to have two separate parties just so you can invite one to one and one to the other. And you have to never be seen with that friend because this friend will think you're taking sides. And all of a sudden you're thinking, I don't have a problem with either of them. But my whole life's been drawn into their fracture. And if we're honest, even the simplest of things to do, which is perhaps the most damaging, like telling lies, so quickly a lie starts to spread and the damage gets out of control. So we kind of know and confess that sin is wider than just our relationship with God. See, what fascinates me is that Paul refuses to do what many people would do in order to correct this. He refuses to drop to the sort of lowest level of ethics, rule making. He doesn't roll out a set of rules that say, this is how we'll solve this problem, here's a list of to-dos. Now, if you grew up in church in the last century, you would remember that being a Christian was essentially a list of things that you didn't do. So, when I was a kid, people would say, oh, so you're a Christian, so what's that? And we would start to list off things we don't do. We don't go to the movies, and we don't drink, and we don't go to parties, and we don't go to clubs, and we don't go to bars, and we don't smoke, and we didn't do anything, right? Anything fun, we didn't do it. We grew up learning that. That looks like fun, probably wrong. And so that was the kind of context that we grew up in. And if you hung around long enough in the conversation, eventually you'd find Christians starting to say, well, here's some stuff we do. But most people had gotten bored by that point and stopped hanging around to listen. Paul seems to be aware that you can't change people by rules. You can control them, you can control their behavior, and you can make them do particular things by rules, but you can't actually change them. Rules don't change us, they just hold us in place. Listen, I'm British, right? So I come from a political system that we love rules, right? And so recently some survey work was done in the UK and discovered that actually our sedentary behavior and our love for sugar is causing us problems with our health. So the British government decided to start taxing things with lots of sugar in them. Because that's how you solve a problem, right? Tax. So this was the solution. If we tax this stuff, that'll save everyone. But no, it just meant people were poorer while they did nothing and ate more sugar. And the problem is that often we've done this in the church. Our assumption is that we will simply control you by rules, but Paul doesn't do this. Instead, he starts to ask us about our responsibilities. He starts to ask us about the way that we think and the things that we do, because Paul seems to realize if you can change someone's heart, if you can change the way somebody sees the world and how they go about living their life, then that's the sort of change that will last. So in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, he quotes the Corinthians back at them. It seems that they've said to him that at some point there's been a discussion about what rights we have. And the Corinthians seem to be saying, well, I have the right to do anything. This is a problem the church has always struggled with since its beginning. In a grace-based economy, there's always the potential that people will think that they can do what they like. And actually, that's always the threat in grace-based economies. And instead of Paul jumping in and saying, no, you can't do what you like, instead he changes the narrative slightly. I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. And then Paul rolls out, which in my mind is one of the most profound pieces of moral guidance in the world. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others, Paul says. You see, rights are a complex thing when you follow Jesus. How do human rights work in a church that sets up a crucified Jesus as its Savior? A Jesus who gave up all of his own rights. Paul says this is the core of the gospel earlier on in 1 Corinthians. This is what it's all about, that Jesus was crucified. And if Jesus would give up his own life for us, it's kind of hard for us to put ourselves first. You don't see a guy push to the front of the coffee line and be like, you know what, I'm just trying to follow Jesus. I'm just trying to, model the crucified Jesus by pushing in front of you. We kind of know that's not how that works. And so Paul, in verse 24 of chapter 10, gives you a moral piece of guidance that's based on the crucified Jesus, that no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. It's fascinating to me that Paul creates a moral or ethical code that moves from passive rules to active decisions. You see, rules are quite easy. You don't need to think about them. They're very clear. Here's the line. If you're this side, you're good. If you're that side, you're bad. We say we don't like rules, but we really love rules when we see that other people are bad, right? Because we can see, here's the line, and you've crossed it, and you're outside. But Paul refuses to give that. Instead, he throws the decision back to you and asks you to think about your behavior. You might be able to get away with whatever you want, but how does that affect others? Is your decision-making putting other people first? So Richard Hayes continues by saying this: converts to the faith must work out how to reorder their lives in obedience to Christ, discerning which old customs may be continued and which must be left behind. Work out, discern. Not rules, not regulations, not, hey, welcome to church, here's the guidebook. No, welcome to church, here's our rules. Instead, Paul says the Christian is in this place of having to put the other first. And that's their guiding principle of their life. Now, this principle works its way through all the Corinthian letters. If you work your way through the text, you'll see that every single situation that Paul finds himself in, he rolls out guidance that's based on this sort of premise. So I wanted to test this, and basically let's just pick something that Paul talks about elsewhere in Corinthians and see how this works. And I decided, let's just pick the most contentious of all Christian subjects: money. Coming from a Jewish background, Paul has precedent to think in terms of rules, obligations, and percentages. That's to say, he even has prophetic texts. The minor prophet Malachi, the one that we all think is the Italian guy pronounced Malachi, he writes a text which speaks clearly into issues of finance and giving. He sets up this premise that if you give a particular percentage of your income to God, God will bless you abundantly with finance and wealth and prosperity. And Malachi creates this system by which how giving works and receiving works and how it all comes together. Curiously, despite being apparently an expert in the scriptures, as we see Paul as he works through his letters, despite probably learning these texts as a little boy, he doesn't recourse to any of them. In fact, when Paul writes his second letter to Corinth, and he wants to raise an offering to help a church in Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem is being persecuted. They're unable to survive. Their poverty's gotten really bad. So Paul goes round all of his churches in the Mediterranean and says, we need to do something for these people. They're having a bad time, and we need to raise money for them. But Paul doesn't do any of the things that he even has Bible texts that could support him in doing them. Instead, he says this: remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And then he gives you his principle. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. See, Paul doesn't force people into decision. He doesn't say, here's a percentage, let's all give up a week's salary, let's give up this percentage or that percentage, or here's an actual figure. He throws it to them and says, actually, I'm not going to give you a passive rule. I'm going to ask you to make an active decision. It's not about making some choice in the past and then sticking by it day by day. It's about sitting down and saying, what is God doing in my heart? And how is God changing me? And that's going to be the way that I work it out. Because Paul wants to leave generosity always in the place of active decision and never in the place of passive rules. Notice as well, by the way, just while we've got it on screen, that this isn't a particularly great investment plan according to what we might expect. So whereas in Malachi you give a set percentage and you get the floodgates of heaven poured back, Paul here says, decide what's in your heart, do it cheerfully. God is able to bless you abundantly. Somebody says, amen. So that in all things and at all times having all that you need. Like, I want more than that. Just what I need. I'm doing okay with that myself. I want more than I can dream of. I want more than I ever imagined, not what I need. And then Paul pushes it further. Oh, and by the way, now that you've got all you need, you can work for God. Paul's not offering you a clever investment plan. He doesn't say to the Corinthians, this is a way to get rich. He simply says, this is what it looks like to work out putting others first. God will look after us. God will protect us in our needs. But he has things for us to do. The impact for Paul is not about money for money's return, but the impact is about our lives and not our wallets. Paul's looking for how we're shaped into workers for God. And generosity is more than money. We all know that. Generosity is much broader than just what we do with our checkbook. But it strikes me as I read a text like this, that what would our lives look like if we worked our generosity on our knees rather than on our calculators? What if we sat down and instead of saying, here's a percentage that I always do, what is God doing in my heart? How is my life being changed? What's my trust in God like? How am I relying on God to provide my needs? See, at Westside, we talk about, as part of our mission statement, having startling generosity. And I don't believe that startling generosity in anything that we do will ever be defined by a number or a percentage or a principle, but it will be worked out by what God's doing in us, by what God's doing through us. So no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Or so Paul said to Corinth. But imagine what the world would be like if we lived like that. And forget the world for a second. What would our church be like if we lived? What would your family actually be like if you sat around your family table and realized that our new principle is that we will not seek our own good, but the good of others? So you may not live in a world where idle meat questions are the ones that regularly affect you. But you probably do live daily in a world where your actions affect others, where the things that you do have implications on other people's lives, where our decisions draw us away from being disciples and draw us back into the world that we left behind, where our allegiances can sometimes make it difficult to also confess that Jesus is Lord, where sometimes our wish for rules make it difficult to live in startling generosity. So I want to pray this blessing over you this morning. It simply goes like this. May you find a way to live your life shaped after Jesus. May his crucified death remind you that we live our lives seeking the good of others, not our own good. May the idle meat that you encounter, whatever it may be, not be the cause of another's difficulty, but an opportunity to call yourself and others into the way of Jesus. And may God's grace and peace be on you. Amen.